This Bible question is an excerpt from our television program, What Do the Scriptures Say? We hope that it will enrich your spiritual life, and we hope that you'll come back to www.scripturesay.com to find answers to your Bible questions. Thank you. And the 24 elders who sit on their thrones before God fell on their faces and worshiped God, saying, "We give you thanks, O Lord, the Almighty, who are and who were, because you have taken your great power and have begun to reign. And the nations were enraged, and your wrath came, and the time came for the dead to be judged, and the time to reward your bondservants, the prophets, and the saints, and those who fear your name, the small and the great, and to destroy those who are on the earth." And so we have here the scene of the temple of God, the holy city, being transferred from earth and to begin the reign in heaven. Now remember that Jesus has been reigning on his throne since the establishment of the church in Acts chapter 2. We know that to be the case. We know that the church, the holy city, the temple of God on earth is where Jesus is reigning. What he's talking about in this place is how at judgment in eternity, this church is transferred into God's presence. And verse 19 says, "And the temple of God which is in heaven was open, and the ark of his covenant appeared in his temple. And there were flashes of lightning and sounds of peals of thunder and an earthquake and a great hailstorm." So there we have, again, this language is used several times in Revelation to help us see that he's talking about the same time period in the trumpets, in the seals, and in the plagues. And here we have then the eternity and judgment, the reality that God will bring about his purpose just as he has planned. The New Testament church needs to know that in spite of difficult times, in spite of persecution, in spite of all of the obstacles and temptations and trials that Satan tries to put in the way of the church's purpose continues to exist in this world, and God will accomplish his purpose through his church no matter what Satan tries to do, and will bring all to judgment someday. That's what Revelation promises. Now, we'll get into chapter 12 when we come back after this. Okay, let's dive right into chapter 12 then. "A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And she was with child, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. And another great sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and his heads were 7 diadems." All kinds of teachings on this particular chapter. I'm going to give you some advanced conclusions before we even begin to look at the chapter so that you can see how this all pulls together. The woman clothed with the sun in this chapter is representative of the church. Now here's a case where we have one symbol that represents a couple of different concepts, but the woman is clearly going to represent in the latter part of chapter 11 the church. In the first part of chapter 11 it's going to represent the Jewish system of things, but here there's a clear contrast intended because of the description that's going to come of the apostate church in Revelation chapter 17. In fact, let's read Revelation 17:4 right here. "The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a gold cup full of abominations and of the unclean things of her immorality." You see this contrast between this glorious woman in 11 and the harlot who is to come. The true church is the glorious woman, and the harlot is the apostate church in the book of Revelation. And we need to see that. We also need to see this symbolism on your graph. You see time, times, and half a time, which equals 3.5. You add time plus times, which is 2. Half a time, that gets you 3.5. knowing that the Jewish calendar was 360 years, and you multiply 360 days. 360 days multiplied by 3.5 equals 1,260. 42 months times 30 equals 1,260. 1,260 days equals times half a time. 3.5 times 12 months equals 42 months. Okay, you got that? There'll be a test later. All of these, again, let me say what you've heard me say a million times now. We're in the book of Revelation. We're studying symbolic languages. People get into all kinds of trouble when they come to this place and they try to figure out what the 1,260 days means. Is it literally 1,260 days? Is it literally 3.5 years? Is it literally 42? What does it mean? It simply means all of these symbols. A time of great despair and confusion. That's what it means. It's not intended to give us a specific time frame on a timeline. It's simply describing a time of great despair and confusion. The church in the wilderness is going to live through a time of confusion and despair. Here, take a look at this graph. You've seen this now several times in our study. What was true with the physical house of God, the physical Israel, and the spiritual house of God, the church, is illustrated on this graph. The church in the wilderness is nourished by God for 1,260 days. Other places in Revelation says 1,000 years. They mean the same thing. 1,260 illustrates that it's a time of confusion and despair, just as the children of Israel, as they wandered in the wilderness, wanted to be in the promised land. The church desires to be in God's presence for all eternity in the promised land. Just as in Israel they needed to be fed by God, they were nourished on manna, God nourishes his church on the Word and from the spiritual waters that flow from his throne. When Jesus returns again at the second coming, then the church will be taken into the promised land or into heaven for all eternity. And this woman clothed with the sun is with child. She is clothed with the sun, with the moon at her feet. And remember, in Revelation now, we've already seen that these bright lights represent not the physical lights, the sun, the physical moon, the literal moon and the literal sun, but spiritual influences. And this woman has 12 crowns upon her head. The child is obviously Jesus. The only question is, what does the woman represent in this context? And it's to represent to us the organized religion of the Jewish faith. The woman of the Old Testament would be the church of the Old Testament, the Jews. And the woman of the New Testament is the church of the New Testament. You're familiar with that language, the church being the bride of Christ. Christ is the bride, waiting for his bridegroom without spot or wrinkle. So we have the Old Testament bringing us the Christ. How does that work? Well, look at these verses. We've got in Galatians, the law was our tutor to bring us to Christ. That's because Christ is the seed of Abraham, and the law teaches us how to be right with God. The promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed, not the seeds as many. Do you see that? And so the old law was given so that the transgressions would be forgiven by the seed, Jesus, who was to come. And then someone asked the question that Paul does in Galatians. He says, why the law then? It was added because of transgressions, having been ordained through angels by the agency of a mediator, until the seed would come to whom the promise had been made. And Galatians 4:4 then tells us, when the fullness of time came, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law. Look at the next verse. Then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns on his heads, and on his heads were 7 diadems or 7 crowns. Here we have the seven-headed beast of Revelation with 10 horns, 10 crowns. We'll talk more about them when we get into this in later chapters, but for our purposes here, we want to simply identify these as the enemies of God's people, the powers during the existence of man on earth that have suppressed God's people. It was first Egypt and Assyria and the Medo-Persians, the Babylonian Empire, the Grecian Empire, the Roman Empire, and the Holy Roman Empires represented there. Those are the 7 heads that he's speaking about in this place. And the dragon, he says in the next verse, his tail swept away 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them down to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour the child. We see that in the New Testament. As Christ comes into the world, Satan makes every effort to do what he can to make sure that the Messiah is killed before he is able to be born and bring redemption to man. We have to go back for the image of the stars to the first chapter of the book of Revelation. In the book of Revelation, you remember that we have these illustrations given to us. It's on our chart right here. The stars representing those people who are faithful to God. Remember, Christ in chapter 1 held the stars, which represented God's faithful in his hand. Heaven is a term that's used to speak not of a place or even a realm, but the symbolic dwelling place of the righteous. And a third, again, is used to refer to the spiritual side of man. And the earth represents those who dwell in the place of sin. He's not talking about the physical earth per se. He's talking about people who live in sin. Now, these are the same people that we've looked at in previous chapters that may be close to God, but who have never been forgiven of their sins. They've never been baptized for the remission of their sins. What the scriptures tell us then in this chapter is that before Christ came, Satan possessed the power to destroy the spiritual part of man. That's why he stands before the glorious woman seeking to devour Christ as soon as he is born. You see, he's so deluded about these things. He had the power before there was forgiveness that he could completely destroy man's spiritual side, but he can no longer. And in this verse, we have the whole life of Christ summarized in just one verse. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule the nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Here we have then the whole summary of what Christ accomplished. That woman bears the child, and he now brings salvation to all mankind. Let's look at the rod of iron when we come back in just a second. Okay, the rod of iron, what is he talking about there? Well, later on we're going to see Christ mounting his white horse, leading the faithful who are dressed in white robes throughout the world, carrying the gospel, which is the rod of iron. You see, the gospel has the power to destroy all of the other kingdoms and governments. The gospel is the power in the world today. It is the only power that will last for time and eternity. And then when her child was caught up to heaven, to God and to his throne, here you see how brief the scripture goes through this. Here Jesus' entire life is summarized in just one verse. Then after Christ is taken into heaven, we have the next verse that says, then the woman fled into the wilderness where she had a place prepared by God, so that there she would be nourished for 1,260 days. Here we again are called back to this graph, which shows the comparison between the physical kingdom of Israel and the spiritual kingdom, the church. The church is in the wilderness. The woman flees into the wilderness to a place prepared for 1,260 days. It's descriptive of that confusion and despair in this world of sin, in this world of spiritual darkness. The church resides in the wilderness, longing for the time when we can once again be in God's presence. It's a time of despair and confusion for an indeterminate period of time. It's a longer period of time than, remember in the previous chapter, the dead body of the church laid in the streets for 3.5 days, probably talking about the dark ages. Now we've got 1,260 days. It's a longer period of time that the church is in the wilderness. While mankind is in sin, to remedy that problem, baptism into Christ, the blood of Christ, brings us into the church of Christ. And there we stand before the emerald throne and receive the water of life. When Jesus comes again, this kingdom goes into the promised land. And that brings us to the war in heaven. And I want to talk about that briefly when we come back. Okay, let's read this passage. And there was war in heaven, Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon. The dragon and his angels waged war. And they were not strong enough, and there was no longer a place found for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world, and he was thrown down to earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down, he who accuses them before our God day and night. The question is, when did this war take place? Here is again Pat Marvinko Smith's vision of this war that is taking place. And the one criticism I might have about this description would be that we should not think of this war as a one-time event. It's something that's been going on between Satan and God's people throughout the centuries, before the woman gave birth to the child and since the woman has given birth to the child. When did this war take place? You ought to hear the commentators on this one. You cannot subtract verse 7 from the things that are spoken of in verse 10. We must know the context before we come to a conclusion. How many times on this program have you heard me say, context, context, context? When the things mentioned in verse 10 occurred, that's when the things mentioned in verse 7 occurred. He says, now the salvation, look at this graph, the salvation, the power, the kingdom, the authority have come. In other words, when Christ was resurrected from the dead, that's when those things occurred. Heaven is a symbolic reference to the dwelling place of the righteous in the Scriptures. Satan and his angels are cast out of influencing God's righteous people down to earth, which represents the place of sin in this world. And verse 14 says, therefore, since the children share, by the way, this is Hebrews 12, verse 14. Therefore, since the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same, that through death he might render powerless him who had the power of death, that is the devil, and might free those who through fear of death were subject to slavery all their lives. For assuredly he does not give help to angels, but he gives help to the descendant of Abraham. You see, the Hebrew writer is describing what we're seeing here in the book of Revelation. Heaven is symbolic of the dwelling place of the righteous. We know that to be true by the way that term is used throughout the New Testament in Ephesians chapter 2, for example. In the heavenly places, he's talking about not a place in heaven, but where the righteous dwell in his church. Satan and his angels are cast down to earth. In other words, to those who live in sin, he no longer can have any influence over those who have been forgiven of their sins, in the sense that he can harm their souls. His work now is amongst those who live in sin. Now that the salvation has come, now that the power has been given to the church and the kingdom has been established and all authority that Christ possesses, now that that has come because of the resurrection of Christ, now Satan has been limited. Now, when I say that, I don't mean to indicate that Satan cannot tempt Christians, that he doesn't cause them to fall. That's not at all what I'm saying. All I'm saying is he is limited in his ability. Before there was forgiveness, he could completely overpower everyone. There was no forgiveness. Overcoming in the book of Revelation has to do with our baptism into Christ. We overcome this world of sin when we are baptized into Christ, and that's what Revelation 12 tells us here. They overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb and because of the word of their testimony, and they did not love their life even when faced with death. They overcome him when they are baptized into Christ. They overcome the world of sin. And this irritates Satan. You see what he says here in verse 12? For this reason rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the earth and to the sea, because the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, knowing that he has only a short time. We know from what the Scriptures teach us in 1 John 5 that the whole world lies in the power of the evil one, and that's exactly what Revelation is telling us here. Satan no longer can have influence in the spiritual realm because forgiveness of sins is there. He can cause stumbling and temptation, but he can't condemn a soul because the church has forgiveness. But those who live in sin on the earth and in the sea, in the masses of people who, some of them may be very close to God, but have never been obedient, never been baptized for the remission of sins, those people need to be warned. The only people that the devil and his angels have control over in this world are those who are sinful in the sight of God. We need to listen to the Scriptures. And when the dragon saw that he was thrown down to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. Satan is ready to persecute the church because he doesn't want the message of salvation to come into this world. But the two wings of the great eagle were given to the woman so that she could fly into the wilderness to her place where she was nourished for a time and times and half a time from the presence of the serpent. You see, God provides a place of safety, a place of protection for his people, for those who have been obedient. He brings them on wings of angels, the wings of a great eagle. It reminds us of what Exodus says. When God spoke to his children, he said, "You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." It's the promise that's found in 1 Corinthians 10:13, that no temptation will overtake us. God has provided a place, a sanctuary. And here again is our little graph that Lonnie Woodruff has provided for us. The church in the wilderness is that safe place. It's the place where we stand before the throne of God clothed in white robes. The serpent pours out water like a river out of his mouth after the woman so that he might cause her to be swept away with the flood. We've seen water now representing spiritual teachings, and now Satan wants to pour out these doctrines of demons and commandments and traditions of men, and the earth, the spiritual side of man on earth who is sinful in the sight of God, swallows up those waters. God intended to be like the fountains of waters, but man made for himself broken cisterns, and the water helped the woman. The earth opens its mouth and drinks up the water that's provided by Satan. This is again a description of the false teachings that come into the world, that Satan allows parts of those who call themselves Christians but who have never been obedient to believe. So the dragon was enraged with the woman and went out to make war with the rest of her children who kept the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. You see why it's so important we follow the Bible and the Bible only, because the wormwood that comes from Satan is pervasive in this world. Don't listen to it. Listen to the Word, and we'll see you next week on What Do the Scriptures Say? We thank you for your interest in What Do the Scriptures Say? We hope that you will come back to scripturesay.com often for answers to your Bible questions. See you then.